8 habits keeping you broke. It's not your salary. It's not the economy. It's not bad luck. There are 8 habits quietly keeping you broke, and you're probably doing at least 3 of them right now. You could double your income tomorrow and still end up broke in 5 years if these 8 habits don't change first. If you've ever wondered where all your money actually goes, don't leave. This is exactly for you. There's a belief that keeps far more people stuck financially than most are willing to admit. The belief that being broke is primarily about circumstance. Not enough income, the wrong job, bad timing, bad luck. And while circumstances absolutely play some role in anyone's financial situation, the deeper truth, the one most people avoid looking at too closely, is that being broke is far more often a habit than a circumstance. Behavior, repeated consistently over years, shapes financial reality far more powerfully than any single external condition ever could. Consider this carefully. 2 people can earn the exact same salary, work in the exact same industry, live in the exact same city, and end up 10 years later in completely different financial realities. One of them builds savings, reduces debt, and creates a growing sense of security. The other remains in a perpetual cycle of living paycheck to paycheck, regardless of how much the paycheck itself has grown over that same decade. If circumstance alone determined financial outcomes, this divergence wouldn't be possible. Same income, same starting conditions, and yet 2 entirely different results. What separates them isn't the number they were paid, it's the pattern of decisions each of them made, repeatedly, with the money that passed through their hands. This is exactly why raising income alone rarely solves a broke situation on its own. It feels like it should. It seems logical that more money coming in would automatically translate into more financial security. But without a shift in the underlying habits, additional income simply becomes additional spending, absorbed almost immediately into whatever pattern was already established. This is why so many people who receive substantial raises, unexpected windfalls, or even life-changing sums of money still find themselves broke again within a relatively short period of time. The circumstances changed dramatically. The habits didn't. And habits, given enough time, will always outweigh circumstances in determining the eventual outcome. Understand what a habit actually is in this context. It's not a single decision made once. It's a pattern, repeated so consistently that it stops requiring conscious thought. The habit of spending impulsively doesn't announce itself as a major decision each time it happens. It's shaped day after day by decisions you're fully capable of changing. This is also why financial transformation rarely happens through a single dramatic event, like winning money or landing an unexpected promotion. Real transformation happens when someone finally examines their repeated patterns honestly, where the money actually goes, which decisions get made automatically without thought, which habits have been quietly running the show for years, and begins replacing those patterns, one repeated decision at a time, with different ones. This process is slower and far less exciting than the fantasy of a lucky break solving everything. But it's also the only process that actually produces lasting results, because it addresses the real cause rather than simply changing the surrounding circumstances while leaving the underlying pattern completely untouched. So before blaming the salary, the economy, or the unfairness of circumstance, it's worth asking a more honest question. What habits, repeated consistently over years, have actually been shaping this outcome? Because circumstances shift constantly, for better or worse, largely outside of anyone's control. But habits are different. Habits can be examined, interrupted, and rebuilt, starting with the very next decision made about money, regardless of how many years the old pattern has already been running. There's an image worth sitting with when it comes to understanding why so many people struggle financially, despite never making one obviously catastrophic decision. A large ship rarely sinks because of one massive, dramatic hole in its hull. More often, it sinks because of dozens of small leaks, scattered across the vessel, each one too minor to trigger alarm on its own, but collectively powerful enough to pull the entire ship underwater over time. Financial struggle works almost exactly the same way. It's rarely the one large purchase that keeps someone broke. It's the dozens of small, unexamined habits, quietly bleeding money beneath the surface of conscious awareness, day after day, month after month. Think about how most people actually approach financial danger. They watch carefully for the big decisions, the major purchase, the significant investment, the large loan. These decisions feel important enough to deserve scrutiny, and so they usually get it. But this careful attention to large decisions creates a dangerous blind spot around everything smaller, because small expenses don't feel like they deserve the same level of examination. A subscription that costs a modest amount each month doesn't feel threatening. A daily convenience purchase doesn't feel significant enough to track. And because none of these small leaks feel individually dangerous, they rarely get questioned, rarely get canceled, rarely get reconsidered, even as they continue quietly draining resources month after month, completely unnoticed. This is exactly why so many people who avoid dramatic financial mistakes still end up broke. They never took out a reckless loan. They never made one disastrous purchase. And yet somehow, the money still isn't there when they need it. The explanation almost always lives in the accumulation of small leaks rather than any single large one. Multiple unused subscriptions running silently in the background. Convenience purchases made reflexively, without any real thought, simply because they're small enough to feel harmless in the moment. Small fees, small upgrades, small impulse buys, none of them dramatic individually, but stacked together across an entire year, they represent a significant, often shocking sum that most people never actually calculate, because doing so would require confronting something uncomfortable about their own patterns. Here's what makes small leaks particularly dangerous compared to large ones. Large financial mistakes tend to generate immediate consequences, which means they get noticed and corrected relatively quickly. A large, obviously reckless purchase creates visible strain almost right away, forcing a person to confront it. But small leaks don't create that same immediate pressure. Each one, individually, is genuinely too minor to cause noticeable strain on its own. This means they can continue indefinitely, sometimes for years, without ever triggering the kind of alarm that would prompt someone to examine and correct them. The ship takes on water slowly enough that nobody notices it sinking until the water has already risen dangerously high. This is why the habit of tracking small expenses, as unglamorous and tedious as it sounds, tends to produce far more financial improvement than most people expect. It's not because tracking itself creates wealth. It's because tracking exposes the leaks that had been operating invisibly, allowing them to finally be addressed individually, one small correction at a time. Most people who actually sit down and calculate their true monthly spending, broken into specific categories, are genuinely surprised by what they find. Not because they suspected nothing, but because small leaks are specifically designed, by their very nature, to avoid detection unless someone deliberately goes looking for them. So the discipline worth building here isn't about eliminating every small pleasure or living in constant austerity. It's about awareness, knowing exactly where every leak exists, deciding deliberately which ones are worth keeping and which ones have simply been running unexamined, out of habit rather than actual value. Because a ship doesn't need one massive hole to end up underwater. It simply needs enough small leaks, illuminated long enough, accumulating quietly beneath a surface nobody thought to examine closely. Financial security works the same way. It's rarely destroyed by one dramatic mistake. It's slowly drained by dozens of small ones, patient enough to remain invisible until the moment someone finally decides to look. There's a pattern hiding underneath a huge amount of financial struggle that has almost nothing to do with money itself, and everything to do with what money is being used for emotionally. Many of the habits keeping people broke were never really about finances at all. They were coping mechanisms, dressed up as purchases, used to soothe stress, boredom, loneliness, or emotional discomfort, instead of actually addressing whatever the real problem underneath happened to be. Think about how this plays out in ordinary life. A difficult day at work leaves someone feeling drained, undervalued, exhausted by circumstances they couldn't control. Instead of processing that exhaustion directly, instead of resting or talking to someone, or simply sitting with the discomfort long enough to understand it, the instinct becomes to buy something, a treat, a small indulgence, something that offers immediate relief from the emotional weight of the day. And in that moment, it works. The purchase genuinely does provide a temporary lift, a small dose of pleasure that interrupts the discomfort, even if only briefly. Another postponement of the same unresolved issue, repeated again and again, until spending becomes less about acquiring things and more about managing feelings that were never actually dealt with directly. This is why so many people struggle to understand their own spending patterns when they try to analyze them logically. They look at a purchase and ask, "Did I need this?" And the honest answer is often no. But the question itself misses the actual function the purchase was serving. It was never really about need in the practical sense. It was about need in the emotional sense, the need for relief, for comfort, for a brief escape from something uncomfortable that hadn't been addressed. Until that underlying emotional need gets recognized and dealt with directly, no amount of budgeting advice or financial discipline will fully solve the problem, because the spending was never really the disease. It was only ever the symptom. This is also why willpower alone so often fails to change these particular habits. Willpower is designed to resist temptation, but comfort spending isn't purely about temptation. It's about genuine emotional need, seeking relief through the most familiar channel available. Telling someone to simply stop spending without addressing what that spending was actually providing emotionally is like telling someone to stop reaching for a bandage without ever treating the wound underneath. The reaching will continue because the wound is still there, still requiring attention, regardless of how many times the bandage gets removed. Real change here requires a different kind of honesty than most financial advice accounts for. It requires actually pausing in the moment discomfort arises and asking a much harder question than, can I afford this? It requires asking, what am I actually feeling right now? And is this purchase genuinely going to resolve that feeling or simply distract me from it temporarily? This kind of pause is uncomfortable precisely because it interrupts a pattern that's been providing relief, however temporary, for a long time. But that discomfort is exactly where the real solution lives. Not in the spreadsheet, not in the budget, but in finally addressing the emotional need that spending had been quietly, ineffectively trying to solve all along. Because until the real discomfort gets faced directly, the spending will keep finding new disguises, new justifications, new small purchases that feel harmless in isolation. The money will keep leaving, and the underlying problem, the one actually driving the pattern, will remain exactly where it's always been, unresolved, waiting patiently underneath every transaction that was only ever a temporary way of looking away from it. Let's finish with the deepest layer of this entire conversation, the one underneath every habit we've already discussed. Your money habits don't exist in isolation. They're expressions of something deeper, something most people never examine directly, and that something is financial identity. You don't rise to the level of your income, you fall to the level of your financial identity, no matter how much money passes through your hands. And until that identity shifts, no amount of income increase, no budgeting technique, no temporary discipline will produce results that actually last. Think about what financial identity actually means. It's the quiet, often unconscious set of beliefs a person carries about who they are in relation to money. Some people carry an identity that says, I'm someone who's naturally bad with money. Others carry an identity that says, I'm someone who was never taught how any of this works. Still others carry an identity shaped by scarcity, formed early in life, that whispers, there's never quite enough, so spend it while you can, because saving never really worked out before. None of these identities are usually stated outright. They operate quietly, in the background, shaping decisions long before conscious thought ever gets involved. This is exactly why raising someone's income rarely fixes a broken relationship with money on its own. Income operates on the surface. Identity operates underneath it, silently directing where that income actually goes, regardless of how large the number happens to become. A person whose financial identity says, I'm always just barely getting by, will find a way to remain just barely getting by, even after a significant raise, because their spending patterns, saving patterns, and overall relationship with money were never built around the actual number in their income. They were built around the identity. And identity has a remarkable ability to create circumstances that match whatever it already believes to be true. This is also why some people, despite modest incomes, manage to build genuine security over time. Their financial identity says something entirely different. I'm someone who plans ahead, or I'm someone who makes deliberate decisions with money, or simply, I'm someone who takes this seriously. That identity, quietly operating in the background, shapes thousands of small decisions in a completely different direction than scarcity or carelessness would have shaped them. The income might be modest, but the identity behind it is doing far more work than the income ever could on its own. Here's what makes this such an important distinction. Most people trying to fix their finances focus entirely on behavior, without ever addressing the identity generating that behavior in the first place. They try to save more, spend less, Budget carefully, and for a while, through sheer effort, it might even work. But if the underlying identity hasn't actually changed, that effort eventually becomes exhausting to sustain because it's fighting against a deeper self-concept that hasn't been updated to match the new behavior. Eventually, exhaustion wins. The old identity reasserts itself, and the old patterns quietly return, exactly as they always have before. Real, lasting change requires addressing this at the identity level directly. It requires asking, honestly, what do I actually believe about myself in relation to money? And then examining whether that belief was ever accurate, or whether it was simply absorbed years ago from circumstances, upbringing, or repeated experience that no longer reflects who you're capable of becoming. This is uncomfortable work because it requires confronting beliefs that have often been operating for decades, completely unexamined, treated as simple fact rather than as changeable identity. But here's the encouraging truth buried inside this challenge. If identity was built through repetition and belief, it can also be rebuilt the exact same way. Every small decision made in alignment with a new, more empowered financial identity reinforces that identity a little further, the same way years of the old identity were built through repeated, smaller decisions in the opposite direction. Change the identity, deliberately, decision by decision, and the habits eventually follow naturally, no longer requiring constant force to maintain. And once the habits shift to match the new identity, the results, in time, quietly follow right along with them. If you've ever felt embarrassed looking at your own bank account, if you've worked hard for years and still feel like you have nothing to show for it, comment "break the habit" right now so I know you're ready for real change. Because the next 4 habits are the ones almost nobody wants to admit to. And that missing piece is precisely why so many goals, despite being sincerely wanted, quietly die somewhere between January and March, forgotten by the very person who wrote them down with such enthusiasm. Think about what a goal actually is, stripped down to its basic structure. It's a wish, given a deadline. I want to earn more money becomes a goal the moment you attach a number and a date to it. I want to be healthier becomes a goal the moment you attach a target weight and a timeline. This transformation feels significant in the moment. Writing down a specific number, a specific date, gives the wish a sense of seriousness it didn't have before. But underneath that specificity, nothing structural has actually changed. You still don't know what daily actions will get you there. You still haven't built the habits required to sustain the effort over time. You've simply made the wish more precise, without making it any more achievable. This is exactly why so many goals collapse under the weight of their own good intentions. The goal creates urgency without creating capability. It tells you what the future should look like, without equipping you with any reliable way to build that future day by day. And so, predictably, the first few weeks go well, driven entirely by the initial excitement of having finally decided on something. But excitement was never designed to last for months. Excitement is a spark, not a fuel source. And once that spark burns out, usually within a matter of weeks, all that's left is the specific, well-worded wish, sitting there with a deadline attached and no system underneath it strong enough to carry you the rest of the way. Compare this to what a system actually provides. A system doesn't ask you to imagine some distant future outcome. A system asks something much smaller, much more immediate. What will you do today? And will you do that same thing again tomorrow? Regardless of motivation, regardless of how far away the outcome still feels. A system is boring by design, and that boredom is exactly its strength. It doesn't rely on excitement because excitement fades. It relies on repetition, which doesn't require any particular emotional state to keep functioning. This is the piece almost every goal setter skips entirely. They spend enormous energy crafting the perfect goal, specific, measurable, inspiring, deadline-driven, and almost no energy designing the actual system of daily behavior required to get there. It's like spending months planning an elaborate destination for a trip without ever building the vehicle capable of taking you there. The destination might be beautifully described, vividly imagined, deeply desired. But desire alone has never moved anyone forward. Only the vehicle does that. And the vehicle in this case is the system. The specific, repeatable, unglamorous actions performed consistently enough to eventually arrive at the destination the goal originally described. So here's what actually needs to shift. Instead of asking, what do I want to achieve? Start asking, what do I need to consistently do, starting today, regardless of how I feel about it tomorrow? That question forces you past the wish and into the mechanics of actual change. It stops you from mistaking a well-written intention for genuine progress. Because a goal, no matter how clearly defined, no matter how emotionally compelling, remains nothing more than a hope with a calendar attached to it, until it's backed by a system strong enough to carry you toward it on the days when the original excitement has completely disappeared, and all that's left is the discipline to keep showing up anyway. There's a psychological trap built directly into the structure of every goal, and almost nobody notices it until they've fallen into it repeatedly across years of their life. Goals, by their very nature, create a finish line mentality. They teach your mind to treat achievement as an endpoint, a single moment where the pursuit officially concludes and something new is supposed to begin. And this seems harmless on the surface, even logical. Of course, a goal has an endpoint. That's what makes it measurable, achievable, something you can actually mark off a list. But that very structure quietly trains your motivation to behave in a way that eventually works against you. Think about what happens the moment you cross a finish line. In any race, any competition, any achievement, there's a rush, a release, a sense of completion. And then, almost immediately afterward, there's a strange kind of emptiness that most people don't expect. The tension that was pulling you forward for weeks or months suddenly disappears, because the very thing creating that tension, the unreached goal, no longer exists. You reached it. It's done. And in that completion, the engine that had been driving you forward simply runs out of road to travel on. This is why so many people experience an unexpected letdown after achieving something they worked incredibly hard for. They expected satisfaction to expand and settle in permanently. Instead, they feel a strange flatness, a kind of now what moment that nobody warned them about. This isn't a personal failure. It's simply what happens when your entire motivational structure was built around a single finish line. Finish lines, by definition, end. And when the structure of your motivation depends entirely on something that's designed to end, your motivation ends right along with it. Now consider what happens on the other side of this same trap, when a goal is not achieved. The finish line mentality creates an equally damaging pattern here, just in a different direction. If the goal isn't reached by the deadline you set, the entire pursuit can start to feel like a failure, even if enormous progress was actually made along the way. This is because a finish line framework doesn't leave much room for partial victory. Either you crossed the line or you didn't. And when you didn't, the natural conclusion most people draw isn't, I made significant progress and I'll continue. It's, I failed, followed shortly afterward by quiet abandonment of the entire effort, motivation collapsing under the weight of a deadline that wasn't met. This is precisely why goal-driven change is so fragile, regardless of which direction the outcome goes. Hit the goal, and motivation often disappears because the target is gone. Miss the goal, and motivation often disappears because the target feels unreachable. Either way, the structure itself sets you up for eventual collapse, simply because it was never designed to sustain itself beyond a single point in time. Systems solve this exact problem because systems were never built around a finish line to begin with. A system is ongoing by design. There is no single day where the system is officially complete, because the system isn't chasing an endpoint, it's describing an ongoing way of operating. This means a system can't collapse the way a goal collapses, because there's no finish line for it to cross that would remove the reason to continue. The person committed to a system of daily improvement doesn't experience the letdown of finishing, because there is no finishing. There's only continuing, adjusting, refining, and repeating indefinitely. This is the real advantage hiding inside a system-based approach, and it's one most people never fully appreciate until they've experienced the exhausting cycle of finish line motivation collapsing again and again. Systems don't ask you to sprint toward a single point and then stop. They ask you to build a sustainable rhythm capable of continuing long after any single goal would have already concluded. And that difference between chasing an endpoint and committing to an ongoing process is exactly what separates people who experience temporary bursts of change from people who experience change that actually lasts. There's a quiet, dangerous message embedded inside almost every goal a person sets, and most people never consciously recognize it, even though they carry it with them for years. That message says, without ever saying it out loud, I'll be satisfied once I arrive. It sounds harmless, even motivating, when you first hear it framed that way. Of course, course, satisfaction is on the other side of the goal. That's the entire point of setting one in the first place. But this belief, repeated across goal after goal, decade after decade, creates something far more damaging than most people realize. It creates a life where happiness is permanently scheduled for a future date, one that keeps quietly moving further away the closer you get to it. Think about how this actually plays out. You set a goal, a certain income, a certain title, a certain relationship status, a certain physical result, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet agreement forms. Once I reach this, I'll finally feel like enough. Once I reach this, I'll finally relax. Once I reach this, the striving can stop, at least for a while. This agreement feels reasonable in the moment. It even feels motivating because it gives your effort a clear emotional payoff waiting on the other side. But here's what almost nobody accounts for in advance. Once you actually reach that goal, the satisfaction you were promised yourself rarely arrives in the form or duration you expected. And almost immediately, a new goal quietly takes its place, carrying the exact same promise. Once I reach this next one, I'll finally feel like enough. This pattern can repeat itself for an entire lifetime without the person ever noticing they're caught inside it. Each individual goal feels different, feels like it will be the one that finally delivers lasting satisfaction. But the underlying structure never changes. Satisfaction keeps getting assigned to some future point, and the future, by its very nature, never actually arrives. Because the moment it does arrive, it's simply the present again. And the mind, trained by years of this pattern, immediately starts scanning for the next future point to assign satisfaction to instead. This is why some of the most outwardly successful people carry a strange, persistent restlessness underneath their accomplishments. They've hit goal after goal, each one meant to finally deliver the sense of arrival they were chasing. And yet the arrival never fully lands, because they were never actually trained to experience satisfaction in the present. They were trained, goal after goal, to postpone it. The finish line kept moving, sometimes by their own design, sometimes simply because human ambition rarely stays still once it's tasted momentum. And so the satisfaction that was supposed to be waiting at the end of the goal remains permanently just out of reach, one finish line always visible just beyond the last one. This is one of the most overlooked costs of goal-driven living. It doesn't just risk the failure of not reaching a goal. It risks something arguably worse, which is reaching goal after goal and still never feeling like enough time has passed. Enough has been accomplished. Enough has finally been proven. Because the entire structure was built around future satisfaction, the present moment, no matter how objectively successful it looks from the outside, rarely gets permission to simply be enough on its own. This is exactly why building a life around systems, rather than goals, offers something goals structurally cannot. A system asks you to find some measure of satisfaction in the process itself, in the daily rhythm, in the act of continuing to show up, rather than assigning all your emotional reward to some future outcome that hasn't happened yet. This doesn't mean abandoning ambition or no longer wanting more. It means refusing to hand your present-day peace over to a future date that keeps shifting further away the moment you approach it. Because a life spent constantly waiting to finally arrive is not a life anyone was meant to live. And the only way out of that exhausting wait is learning to find genuine satisfaction in the process, long before any single outcome ever proves you were worthy of feeling it. Let's close with the truth that changes everything once it's actually understood. People don't sustain change because they wanted an outcome badly enough. Desire alone has never been the deciding factor. History is full of people who wanted something desperately, who cried over the wanting, who would have given almost anything for the outcome to be real. And still, despite that intensity of desire, the change didn't last. This should tell you something important. If wanting were enough, everyone who wanted badly enough would already have what they're chasing. Clearly, something deeper than desire is required, and that something is identity. Here's the distinction that matters. A goal lives outside of you. It's a destination, a number, an outcome sitting somewhere in the future, separate from who you currently are. You can want that outcome intensely and still remain, internally, exactly the same person you've always been. This is precisely why so many goal-driven efforts eventually collapse. The person pursuing the goal never actually changed. They simply tried to force an old version of themselves toward a new outcome, using willpower and motivation as the only fuel. And willpower, as anyone who's tried to sustain it knows, runs out far sooner than most people expect. Identity-based change works entirely differently because it doesn't ask you to force an old self toward a new outcome. It asks you to become a new self first, and then simply allow that new self to naturally produce different outcomes, almost as a byproduct of who you now are, rather than as the result of constant, effortful pursuit. This distinction sounds subtle, but it changes everything about how sustainable the change actually becomes. A person trying to save money through sheer willpower is constantly fighting against their old spending identity, white-knuckling their way through every purchasing decision. A person who has actually shifted into being someone who manages money wisely isn't fighting anything. That identity simply makes different decisions naturally. The same way a person who identifies as tidy doesn't have to force themselves to clean up, it's simply consistent with who they understand themselves to be. This is why identity-based change tends to last long after goal-based change has already collapsed. A goal can be achieved, and once achieved, the driving tension disappears, along with the behavior that was sustained by that tension. But an identity doesn't have a finish line, because an identity isn't something you complete, it's something you continue being, day after day, in ways that don't require the constant renewal of motivation. The person who has become disciplined doesn't need fresh motivation every single day to remain disciplined. Their discipline has become part of how they understand themselves, and that self-understanding continues operating quietly in the background, even on days when motivation is completely absent. This is also why so many people who achieve a goal end up reverting back to old patterns shortly afterward, a frustration that confuses almost everyone who's experienced it. They reached the number on the scale, and within a year, the weight returned. They hit the savings target, and within months, the old spending habits crept back in. This reversal isn't a mystery once you understand identity. The goal was achieved, but the underlying identity was never actually rebuilt. The person achieved a temporary outcome while still fundamentally remaining the same person they were before. And that old identity, still fully intact underneath the achievement, eventually pulled their behavior back toward whatever felt familiar and consistent with who they still believe themselves to be. So here is the real work, the work that goes far deeper than simply setting a better goal or building a stronger system. It's the willingness to actually examine and reconstruct your own identity, deliberately, at the level of belief, not just behavior. Ask yourself not, what do I want to achieve, but who do I need to become in order for this outcome to feel like a natural, inevitable extension of who I already am? Because once that identity shift genuinely happens, the goals stop requiring constant force to reach. They simply become the visible evidence of an invisible transformation that already occurred, quietly, at the level where lasting change was always actually meant to happen.